Right. Good morning and welcome everyone to the 2024 Land Use and Housing Laws Monthly Engagement Series. Oh, Kelly, let's stay on that first slide for 1 second. This is our kickoff meeting. I'm Casey McPherson, the Senior Planner in the Department of Local Affairs, Division of Local Government. I'm excited to orient you today to our implementation work and engagement process. Next slide. We'll be covering 5 bills that passed last session that are now law: residential occupancy limits, minimum parking, ADUs or accessory dwelling units, transit-oriented communities or TOCs. Thank you in advance for dealing with our abbreviations. From time to time, we'll work to reduce the acronyms. And then affordable housing planning. That title is also, I should flag for you, our working title. If you recall, it's a little longer in the bill that was passed, but generally housing planning from 174. These laws have significant overlap, particularly in subject jurisdictions. So we're implementing a multi-law engagement process in the hopes of avoiding burnout as much as possible. Next slide. Here's what that engagement process is going to look like, and I'll go top to bottom. So first off, we have our local government advisory group. This is a casual email thread for membership organizations, so thinking CML, CCI, the MPOs, to be kept in the loop so that they can promote engagement opportunities to their members. As I hope you'll see as we talk through our slides today, this is all oriented around trying to make sure everyone has access to any information of interest. Next up, we have our monthly tool-based engagement meetings. That's today. This is our first one. And this is going to be a standing time for agencies to present draft implementation tools, receive input, and provide guidance for how to contribute to additional refinement. The audience for meetings like today is generally subject jurisdictions, non-subject jurisdictions that may want to opt in, and any interest groups listed in the legislation. So these are going to be times for us to really dig in on these implementation tools and get input, refinement, make sure that they end up being tools that help subject jurisdictions and those that opt in implement the legislation. Now, the next two are more nuanced types of meetings. We also are going to be hosting bi-weekly office hours and supplemental one-on-ones. Both of these engagement offerings are meant for subject jurisdictions that want to dive into the weeds of how a certain law or laws work in their jurisdictions. If you have a question about a specific station and how it relates to transit-oriented communities law or anything that is of a subject jurisdiction specific nature, these would be the meetings for you. The monthly engagement meetings will be a little higher level, though we're going to want some specific input, but we do recognize that it's sort of a lot of information that may be coming at you, and it will be likely that a majority of comments we get will happen subsequently and through our webpage that I'll discuss in just a moment. Next up, we're also doing ad hoc presentations. So this is additional outreach with interested parties, legislators, advocates, and so on. Essentially, anyone who may be interested in getting information about what we're creating and where we're at in the timeline, I'm happy to provide information to those groups. And then finally, we're excited to announce that we have launched our Engage DOLA webpage. This will be an interactive tool that will host recordings of these meetings, agendas, frequently asked questions, and our draft implementation tools for comment. So there will be comment forms on there, and we'll demo this to you so you can see what in the world we're talking about. And there's an image of it there on this slide, so you can get a little preview as well. But if you're wondering for more information or how to engage, we're hoping that this page will be your first station of information. And then, of course, we'll be available, and we have our contact information at the end for you to reach out subsequently as well. Next slide. So here is a sample of how we're intending to run these monthly engagement meetings. We are implementing these related yet distinct laws, and so we're hoping to present them to you as tracks. You'll see from this table that they generally follow the laws, right? TOC, parking, housing planning. Neighborhood centers and strategic growth planning, it has put a little bit of nuance, and so we decided to make that its own track. So trying to group things together based on what your interests may be, so that as you're doing something like reviewing a recording of one of these monthly meetings that you couldn't make it to, or something like that, you'll be able to speed ahead and skip what you maybe don't need to want to worry about and focus in on the track that's of interest to you. Next slide. This will show you what does that look like. Today, we are bringing that to life. So I am currently giving the general updates. Then Nathan and Kelly are going to go through TOC. Kelly will take us then through parking, Nathan through neighborhood centers and strategic growth planning, and I will round it out with housing, planning, displacement, and ADUs. All of this has been a huge team effort. So I also want to pause on this slide and just give a huge thank you both to Scott Williamson on my team, as well as Kelly Blinn and Nathan Lindquist. And hello, John and Eleni, too, from the governor's office. This has certainly been a multi-agency effort. And I can say that that not only has been directed in the legislation itself, but just from my perspective, it's been quite fabulous to be able to work in this interdisciplinary way across those usual silos and other types of metaphors. So we're excited to present this agenda to you. And then on the next slide, just a few comments. So that's how we're intending to bring to you. If you're wondering, all right, well, what do I do with this? I have a few comments before we dive in. Sorry, there's so much language on this slide. I know I'm breaking a rule there, but on we go. First off, these meetings are meant to provide implementation updates, introduce draft and final tools, and solicit input. Therefore, your questions are critical to a successful implementation. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today, and for any time you may spend subsequently on our webpage or otherwise interacting with us as we roll all this out. Next up, we will plan to post a recording of this presentation, just the presentation portion. We're hoping to have time for Q&A at the end. We'll put that recording on Engage DOLA. So please, as we're going through these slides, use the any chat feature to ask questions during this presentation portion rather than unmuting, but do feel free to unmute at the end. As I said sort of before we started, for those that were on, the webinar format is new to us. So please forgive any bumps as we start to explore this platform for these monthly meetings. Next up, we'll capture the questions in our FAQ section of Engage DOLA to ensure broad information access. So as you'll see today, that page really will be foundational to reviewing progress and providing us with your feedback. And I also mention that because if you're worried about where will any FAQs from this meeting go, they'll go on that page. So they certainly will be made available. We're only meaning to clip the recording of the presentation as a kindness to those that may be reviewing the recording later. So trying to keep it efficient, and then also providing some space for the free-form Q&A at the end. So you won't have to worry about how you ask a question and how it's presented in a recording. And then finally, you'll notice that there will be a discrepancy between how much information we provide today on each law. We're going to dive into more detail on transit-oriented communities and parking because those are the first out of the gate tools that we have in draft form and we'll need your input on. We're going to skip detail for the other laws and simply present you with the upcoming input timelines. If you do want more of that orientation information on any of those laws that we're not providing as much information on today, ADU and housing planning, then please ask by chat. We'll try and respond by chat, or you can also review our overview webinar or our web pages that describe the requirements and applicability of each law. Those are hyperlinked here, and yes, we will make the slides available by way of email follow-up and potentially posting on Engage DOLA. So I haven't built that feature in, so please don't hold me to that yet. Okay, with that, we're ready to move into the main agenda, and so I will hand it off.
All right, thanks, Casey. Good morning, everybody. The first thing we're going to talk about today is transit-oriented communities and some of the work we've been doing on that. These initial slides are some overviews of the basic concepts in the law, and I'm going to go really quickly through them because Kelly Blinn will be really handling the details of the mapping, which is really the core topic that has to be discussed because we have to finalize those maps by September 30th. So I'm going to go through these quickly. Next slide. We've been just working on some core concepts with graphics and images. First here is the timeline, and just discusses about the next year of timelines to work on transit area mapping, calculation model development, TOD guidance, and the preliminary TOC assessment report. Next slide. And then here between 2025 and 2028 are some other major deadlines that'll be coming up for grant programs, reporting, and other implementation items. Next slide. So we wanted to give a quick overview of these concepts. There's a lot of similar terms in the bill. So we want to make sure that we're giving some graphics that clearly define them. This talks about transit areas, which the purpose is to calculate the housing opportunity goal and define where transit centers may be located. Next slide. And then this gets to the definition of transit centers and really showing how transit centers are where density is located at the discretion of local governments. Transit areas are kind of the canvas that helps, define the area where transit centers may be, but there's a real difference between those two. So just giving an example here of how that works. Next slide. So then transit centers can count towards the housing opportunity goal if they are located wholly or partially within a transit area. Next, an extra quarter-mile bonus buffer around the transit area. Next, or an optional transit area if it meets certain criteria. Next, and then optional transit areas are 30-minute bus routes, long-range bus rapid transit routes, and then mixed-use pedestrian-oriented neighborhoods, and a lot more detail in 1313 around how those work. Next slide. And then also just to note that transit centers may be located within an optional transit area if a jurisdiction has provided reasonable evidence that this is needed per criteria defined in statute, and optional transit areas do not increase the housing opportunity goal. Next. So that's it for those overview. Of course, we want to meet with jurisdictions one-to-one and in the technical office hours to answer any questions about that, but we just wanted to provide those explanations and graphics before we get into the details of the transit area mapping, and I'll turn it over to Kelly for that right here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nathan. So I'm going to give an overview of the draft maps for the TOC law and associated documents, and definitely encourage everyone to take a closer look at the Engaged OLA site once we send it out so you can review and reach out with any questions or comments you have. So just for orientation, when you get to that page linked here, you'll find links to a few different components, and I did want to highlight in particular, we have a draft mapping documentation document, because we're going to go over at a high level today kind of the statutory direction and what the maps include, but that documentation explains all of that in more detail, what data we used, what the statute says, all that kind of thing. And then in addition, there's an interactive map hosted on ArcGIS Online where you can look at, zoom in, zoom out, look at all the different layers. There's shape files you can download if you'd like to look at it on your own GIS systems. There's also a spreadsheet where you can view all the data if you're not a GIS user, but want to see kind of how the routes or stations were assessed based on the criteria and statute. And then finally, there's a comment form requesting any comments or questions on the data accuracy by September 6th. We know that's quick. So we urge you to do your best. Please reach out to us early if you're, have any questions that we maybe can help answer. But we do have this September 30th deadline and statute that we're trying to reach, and that we hope can, provide some early clarity around the transit areas as they're defined in HB 24-1313. So to start, just wanted to orient to the part of the law that directs the state to publish these maps by the end of September. It includes very prescriptive criteria for what maps to publish and which transit services to include. So that section is 2937-207 if you'd like to read statute. Again, we have it broken down a little bit more in that draft documentation, but it directs the state to map transit areas, which Nathan just described, both stations and corridors, the optional transit areas, and walkshed areas, which we'll get into more, and to create these maps using geospatial data from the relevant transit agencies where the law applies, and from metropolitan planning organizations. So we'll go through each of those. Just some reminders for viewing these maps and reviewing them. Just to follow up on Nathan's slides, we just want to emphasize that these draft maps have been created based on very specific criteria, and so we're encouraging everyone to focus their comments and questions on making sure we kind of have the data right, have everything included that should be. So because these maps will be used to identify the acreage of transit areas that go into that housing opportunity goal formula, and the areas where local jurisdictions can locate transit centers. But once those are set, and again, the hope is that will provide some early clarity, there is significant time and flexibility, as Nathan was describing, to determine how exactly to meet the housing opportunity goal and where to locate those transit centers. So this slide just goes over where these maps apply, so the applicable transit agencies and criteria. The statute directs us to look at transit agencies that operate within MPOs and to assess transit service levels, either based on an applicable transit plan, which is defined, or existing transit service levels as of January 1st of this year. So an applicable transit plan is something that has been approved by the governing body of a transit agency between 2019 and 2024. It identifies the planned frequency and span of service for transit services, and identifies specific routes for short-term implementation. And then for bus rapid transit, these routes are based on MPO's fiscally constrained long-range transportation plans, or again, an applicable transit plan. And so based on our review, these are the transit agencies that this law applies to, including RTD, Transport, Via Mobility or the City of Boulder, and Mountain Metro. And again, you'll have more detail in that draft documentation, but this just sort of spells out how the frequency levels were assessed, whether it was based on an applicable transit plan in the case of RTD, or Transport, or based on existing service levels in the case of the other two. And so I'll walk through this, do some screen share in a moment, but these are the transit stations that are included based on the statutory direction. Includes half-mile buffers around light and commuter rail stations, which only applies to RTD, as well as to commuter bus rapid transit stations, which only applies to Flatiron Flyer. And commuter BRT is defined in the law as a BRT service that operates for a majority of its route on a freeway with access limited to grade-separated interchanges. We also mapped transit corridor areas, which are quarter-mile buffers around urban bus rapid transit corridors that are planned for implementation prior to 2030 or for short-term implementation, as well as frequent bus routes that have at least a frequency of 15 minutes or better for at least 8 hours during a weekday. We also mapped optional transit areas, which Nathan just described. And so this includes both urban bus rapid transit corridors that are planned for further out between 2030 and 2050. There's several DRCOG planned routes that fall into that category. And then also public bus routes with a planned or scheduled frequency of 30 minutes or better. And so that kind of expands the area where transit centers can be located and increases some of that flexibility. Now we'll talk a little bit about the walk sheds component to the bill. This is one of the more complex pieces of the law that was added as an amendment a little bit later, and so some folks may not be as aware of this. So we hope we explain it well today, but we're happy to follow up. So basically, this part of the statute was meant to acknowledge that some transit station areas have a barrier outside of the control of the jurisdiction, like a state-owned highway or railroad tracks that disrupts the potential for transit-oriented development. So some transit station areas, meaning rail or commuter bus rapid transit stations, will be able to exempt parcels that are outside the walk shed area on the side separated from the station by a major barrier. As you can see an image here, where on the northeast side of the highway from the station, the walk shed area applies, and that's marked as yes or in yellow there. And so any transit area parcels outside this are considered exempt parcels. So the walk sheds don't affect where the transit centers can be located. There's still the same flexibility for jurisdictions there, but they do reduce the overall housing opportunity goal calculation in some cases. Again, there's more detail in the mapping documentation, but just wanted to go over at least briefly how we've mapped the walk shed areas. And first off, just because transit stations have a lot of different configurations, we've wanted to make sure that each station area, that the definition of walk sheds was applied consistently. So we did review each station area manually to identify whether and where the walk shed method applies. So when reviewing, you'll be able to see in the notes section of the walk shed layer data to understand what parts of the transit station area the walk shed applies to. So there were a few criteria that we used in assessing these. In terms of stations and station exits, we considered these as platforms and immediately adjacent paved pedestrian areas were all considered part of the transit station. In terms of separation, we considered this as physical separation of the transit station from certain parts of the transit station area by a highway or railroad track. When the railroad track is elevated or below grade, that was not considered to create a physical separation. And we'll show some examples of that in a moment, where pedestrians can, access easily from either side. In terms of railroad tracks, where tracks are embedded in pavement as part of the station, if you think of some of the downtown or W line stations, this was also not considered to create a physical separation. So then once we analyzed where the walk sheds applied, we mapped those using a half-mile walking distance using QGIS, and then split and marked where the walk shed method does and doesn't apply. And one thing just to note is there are some stations where the side that the walk shed applies simply has no walk shed area, as in you can't walk there today because there is no pedestrian bridge over the highway or whatever it may be. And so in those cases, all of the parcels on that side separated from the station are exempt. So these are just a few kind of photo examples of what we mean here. These are a few examples where there isn't a physical separation, and so the walk shed method doesn't apply. So some of those stations in downtown Denver where pedestrians simply walk across the tracks that are embedded in pavement, or for example, this grade separated station on the Wadsworth line where you can approach from either side kind of throughout the transit station area since it's elevated. These are some examples where there clearly is separation. The walk shed method applies. So looking here at the Yale station, which is right up against I-25. There isn't a way to get across there. And then similarly, the Ward Road station on the G line, the platform, connects to the north side here to exit the station, but there isn't a way to exit the station south of the railroad tracks there. Okay, so now I'm gonna stop sharing for a moment and just do a quick demo of how to access the maps and view them. Casey, tell me if I need to speed up.
I think we're doing well, but I'll let you know.
Great.
Besides, this is critical information right here.
Okay. So I'm actually just going to show you the Engaged DOLA site briefly, because you'll see here all those different assets that I described, the interactive map, the documentation, the GIS files, the data spreadsheet, and then the feedback form. So you can find all of those here. I will try to show you the map here. Oh, that didn't switch tab. Hold on. Learning curve, everybody. Thanks for bearing with me. Okay, now we can see maps. So this is the draft interactive map that you'll be able to access and look more closely at once we send it out afterwards. So when you first load it, this kind of splash screen will show up just with some reminders, some instructions for how to view the map, and ways to get back to the Engaged DOLA site there. And this is always accessible from this little eye here in the upper left. In the upper right, you'll always find the legend of the layers that are turned on. So you can see what that's displaying. You have your zoom in and zoom out buttons here in the upper right as well. In the lower right, if you'd like to, you can switch to satellite view if that's helpful for looking at where things are, or you can switch back to this more simplified view. And then probably the most important thing is actually in this lower left here, where you can view all the different layers. And this is hopefully intuitive enough, but there are these little carrots on the left here. The layers are kind of in these little groupings just because there's a few of them. And so wanted to make it a little bit easier to navigate. But you can open these up and I'll zoom in a little just so you can see what these layers look like. We have, the draft station areas. If you click this eye on the right, you can turn any layer on and off. Got the transit corridors. And then we have the transit areas mapped in a few different ways. I have on right now just all the transit areas kind of dissolved into one shape, so you can kind of see it clearly where all the transit areas exist. If you want to see kind of each individual transit area, there's a lot of overlaps, but if that's helpful, that's another way to view this. So you can turn that on and off. And then we also have a version where the transit areas are kind of split by jurisdiction. If you want to just look at the areas that apply within your jurisdiction. Same goes for the optional transit areas. You can click through these different layers. And then we just have a couple of reference layers, mostly just the kind of MPO boundaries and municipality and county boundaries. Last thing I will show here is just, if you're looking for more information on any of these, we do have pop-ups enabled with more information. So you can click on one of these. In this case, the draft transit corridors pops up and you can see the data behind this part of the layer, where the GIS came from, the name of the route, the source for the frequency, how we assess that, all that kind of thing. And these little arrows here, if there's overlapping features, you'll just be able to click through and see the information for all of them.
Kelly, we had a good point in the chat. If you could, you might be you're gonna do this, but just to zoom in on like one and kind of show what it looks like on one station.
Oh, sure.
Not to interrupt your flow if you were gonna get to that.
No, I was just about done. You mean something like this?
Yeah, maybe even a little more.
Okay.
Arvada, you're
here.
lucky.
Yeah, sorry, Armada. So yeah, you can see the transit stations here in red, the corridors in blue, and then this purple right now is just all the dissolved transit areas. And then again, if you wanted to look at it more as individual transit areas, that may be a little easier to look at too, just to understand how these things overlap. So anyway, is that helpful? I don't have the chat in front of me.
Yeah, that's great. And did you already say this, and I may have missed it, about as far as we haven't loaded the walk sheds, right?
Correct. We have a couple things we're checking on there, so hope to get those posted later today or this weekend. So stay tuned.
Yeah. And so once that's up, we just needed to do some more double checking on that. Like kind of within each of these, say, red circles around one of those light rail stations, there'll be kind of a cross-hatched. Here's where or maybe we're not doing cross-hatched, but it'll be a kind of a separate area inside that says, here's the walk shed. Here's where there's not, the walk shed doesn't apply, and it's the normal half circle radius. And then, we can obviously like walk through this in one-to-one meetings because there's a lot of nuance to all of this and a lot of different terms. And so making sure it's all being understood the way that the statute intended. And then we should also frequently remind everyone that of course, these red circles on the maps is not where everywhere in those red circles has to be zoned for high density. Those red circles just are the transit areas. Local governments will designate where the transit centers go. And that is at the discretion of the local governments of, where it makes sense for the density. So we really wanted to make sure that, of course, that's clear when these maps are out there, everyone understands just, because X property is within this red circle does not mean that it is required to be zoned for high density. We may have to come up with like a chant for that and just say it a lot.
Yeah, and I think the other piece just to remember is one of the next steps in calculating the housing opportunity goal too is all the exempt parcels that will be kind of on the subject jurisdictions to subtract out. So you see this applying everywhere, but of course the rights of way, that whole long list of exempt parcels, you'll subtract out. No need to be concerned about those. Just wanted to make a reminder about that too. Casey?
Yeah, this seems like the right time for a few of these questions that are popping up in the Q&A. So you actually just answered this, but to make sure it's ultra clear, these maps then do not include the exempt parcels. That'll be the next step, like Kelly just said. And then there's another question, Kelly and Nathan, whether we've added up the total land area included within the maps subject to the bills. Bill. Let's say maybe not yet.
I don't know if we've looked at the total, but we did look at the amount of transit area in each jurisdiction because that's one of the criteria for determining which jurisdictions are subject. Jurisdictions that have less than 75 acres of transit areas are not subject. And so there is that data in the transit areas by jurisdiction layer.
That's a good point. The other thing that I would say, and maybe this is getting too into the weeds, if you wouldn't mind letting me know, but I would suppose it also depends on the question that's meant to be answered, right? Like A lot of questions that I've been getting so far have been about, well, exactly where might upzoning, for example, happen, or where might changes potentially be planned for. And that's sort of like 3 to 4 steps down the path as compared to the map, because after this calculation is made, it's very, very much subsequent to that that the transit centers would be designated. So anyway, maybe that's too in the weeds for now. I'll hand it back over to you. Did you want to, should we take a look at some more of these questions that are popping up here about the maps?
Sure, I was just looking through them, and Nathan or Casey, feel free to jump in too, because I'm just catching up on what's been
You've been
answered.
I think we're down to, is there a way for us to see the size or distance of the buffer that is used for the layers, like half mile versus quarter mile?
I do think you can kind of see it if you look at the individual transit areas layer here. You can get a sense for the difference between the corridor and the station area buffer sizes. So that may be helpful.
Thank you.
And then I see something about optional transit areas not being active. They should be, but one thing to note is these whole kind of folders, if you will, have a little eye next to them too for visibility. So if, like right now, I just turned off all the transit areas and I can turn on the optional transit areas. So you might have to click that eye for that whole folder, if that helps. Seeing is the intent that the municipalities download the DOLA maps and manipulate them for their individual transit areas with the transit centers and exempt parcels. I think eventually, yes, I think the immediate intent is, please review these as they apply to your jurisdiction and reach out if you have questions or, suggestions about the data if it looks off in any way. We're happy to kind of have those follow-up conversations over time. We'll be working with everyone on those next steps of developing the HOG calculation, doing the exempt parcels, et cetera. But we'll have more time for that than just September 30th. Okay. See this question about Pueblo seems to be blank of transit areas, even though there are 2 bus routes that run at 30 minutes per hour. Because Pueblo doesn't have any 15-minute service routes, those don't qualify as transit areas. So in theory, it could have optional transit areas, but based on how the bill was written, Pueblo is not a subject jurisdiction, so it doesn't have any of those areas mapped. That is different for the parking bill, so we'll get back to that.
Right. I was just going to say that too. Yeah. So yeah, Pueblo, just to be redundant with what Kelly just said, isn't, there's no applicability for the transit center, transit area, kind of more mandatory pieces of 1313. Of course, there's the optional opt-in neighborhood center piece that we'll talk about in a couple minutes. And then because they have 30-minute transit, they do apply with the parking maps, which Kelly will get to in a second.
Great. Looks like folks are typing answers to questions, so in the spirit of time, I'll keep going. Sorry you have to hear me talk a bunch. because I'm going to go through the parking section next. Okay, so just going to give an update on HB 24-1304, the minimum parking requirements law. Here's a quick overview on some of the key dates coming up. We are working on just sort of some more plain language guidance of what the bill says and how it applies that we're aiming to publish next month. We are initiating something that was directed in the law, which was for state agencies to create a parking management best practices and technical assistance materials kind of guide or set of materials that we can provide to jurisdictions complying with the law. That is due by the end of this year, so it's a pretty quick timeline. And so we'll be doing some engagement this fall and are really encouraging folks who are interested in this space or have expertise to engage with us. And I'll have a little bit more detail about kind of the first input opportunity coming up here. And then the compliance date for this law is June 30th of 2025. So again, we've published draft maps for this law as well, kind of the exact same format, just in a separate page or update on the Engage DOLA site, but similar, set of documents, the documentation about how we went about creating these maps, the data used, et cetera, the interactive map, the shape files, a spreadsheet to review, and a comment form. Tried to make it accessible in a few different ways for people based on whether you use GIS or don't, so you can review the data and help us make sure we're getting it right. Again, there's very prescriptive criteria in statute that we follow to publish these maps by the end of next month to designate what are called in the law applicable transit service areas that are meant to be used by local governments in complying with the law. Similar criteria in terms of like the general application, it's transit agencies within MPOs, and transit service levels are assessed based on either an applicable transit plan or existing service levels as of January 1st, 2024. And so the same types of kind of ways that we looked at service and future plans. The one key difference or a couple key differences between the TOC law and the parking law. For parking, there are some additional or different frequency criteria applied in the bill. So for bus routes, it's 30-minute frequency or better for at least 4 hours. And for rail, there's also some time periods where there has to be at least a certain level of service frequency. So based on the criteria and the law, and again, this is all in the documentation more clearly, these are the transit agencies that have one or more routes where HB 24-1304 applies. RTD, transport, again, via mobility, City of Boulder, Mountain Metro, Pueblo, as I mentioned, is included here. Greeley Evans Transit, City of Loveland Transit. And we have Grand Valley here because we did assess all the transit agencies that operate fixed route service in the MPOs, but determined that there weren't routes that meet the frequency criteria to be included. So these are the frequency criteria that were applied. And the other key difference with the TOC law is everything in these maps are around stops or stations. So they're all circles, as opposed to having some circles and some tubes or rectangles, whatever you want to call them. So they're quarter-mile buffers around the light and commuter rail stations that meet certain frequency criteria, commuter bus rapid transit stations, and stops served by public bus routes that meet the frequency criteria in the law. I won't do a screen share again just because it's very similar. And actually the parking map is even a little easier. There aren't those little folders because there's just fewer layers to look at, but it should be all the same functionality to go in and view the data that way. Then last thing, I think this is my last slide. Let's see. Yes. Wanted to circle back to the parking management best practices study and a survey that we're launching. So as I mentioned, we're going to be creating this resource that we need to publish by the end of this year. So it's a bit of a sprint, and hopefully we can build on, adding more resources over time. Kind of the main intent for this resource is to help local governments who are subject to the law and need to remove minimum parking requirements in these applicable transit service areas. So it's to kind of give some tools of how can we manage parking in absence of minimum parking requirements? What are ways we can do transportation demand management, shared parking, et cetera, et cetera. There's a number of topics listed in the law that we'll be diving into and providing some case studies for. To start, we're conducting a survey that's on the Engage DOLA site and are encouraging parking professionals, local government staff, any other parties who are interested in this topic to take the survey. Let us know, ideas of what to include, what you're interested in, if your jurisdiction is interested in implementing certain things, or if you've already implemented them, maybe you're a great case study. So that's sort of the kickoff to this resource. And again, quick timeline, we're hoping you can give us responses in 2 weeks by September 6th so that we can get an idea if we might be interested in participating in some more engagement this fall. So yeah, hope you'll take it, and please spread it around to other folks that you think might be interested.
Hey, Kelly. Before we move on, there are a couple good questions in the chat I think it would be helpful to address. One of them is about TOC versus TOD. Can you provide distinctions for transit-oriented communities versus transit-oriented development? It would be helpful to know when these terms should be used and how they should be distinct from one another. Or Nathan,
Nathan, I saw you come off mute. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I don't know that there's any, kind of standard best practice way to use those terms. I think it's kind of more about when the bill drafters and the sponsors of the bill went with the term transit-oriented communities. It was more just about trying to communicate that we want ideally these areas to feel like communities. Transit, it's not just about transit-oriented development. That's more, I think, about the process of like, how do we get development? But the end goal is to hopefully make these full functioning communities around transit where people have access to not just the transit, but other daily needs, whether that's shopping or daycare or whatever else it might be. So that's my take on it. But unless anyone else has any thoughts, I've never seen anything that is like a strict definition. So I think you're mostly fine with using it either way. We've just gotten used to saying transit-oriented communities because that's the name of the bill, but I don't think there's anything wrong with saying transit-oriented development either.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's the name of the bill, now law, and it's enacting transit-oriented development. So very close. I hope that's distinct enough. Please add a clarifying question if it's not.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah, good question. Nathan, if you would look at the Q&A, there's a longer one I haven't quite fully read through about the TOC map. But Kelly, I was thinking we're okay on time, but might need to speed it up. But I think now might be a good time, and I'd like it in the recording, to just go back to the Engage DOLA site and make sure it's super clear. We've gotten a couple questions about exactly where things are. So as Kelly's queuing that up, I'll just say that the link that we provided goes to the direct land use and housing laws implementation Engage DOLA page. There is an overall Engage DOLA page that doesn't yet link to this subpage, so you're getting a bit of a preview before others will be able to cleanly kind of find that. So It will be added as one of the buckets, so to speak, on the main Engage DOLA page. But for now, you've got this nice direct link. So as you show up onto this page, you'll see that there's an introduction about here are the bills that have been enacted. This is part of our engagement process. You can subscribe for updates. There are the FAQs on the right that are broken out by law. You can also see a thank you, yes, and then you can see what the questions are. You can see a calendar that will have some helpful information on it, like these monthly meetings. Next to that on the right is the draft resources for comment. That is broken out by each law. So you can see, look, there's the documentation to access. Below that is the implementation timeline. You can see that we're here in our August to September era. And then over here on the left is where we've got the updates. So that has the full body of information. Hey, I wanted to comment on some map. What was that with 1313? Here it is in the update section. And it says what we're trying to do and what to review and how to give us feedback on it. You can also, by the way, change the view. Right now we're seeing all these updates. There's also provide feedback, ask a question, sign up for office hours. Lots of functionality here. And by the way, this is the first time that that our office has created one of these pages. So I am deeply interested in what you all think about this page and how to make it more helpful and more user-friendly. So thank you so much for these first clarifying questions, and please keep them coming. Anything else that anyone else would highlight about this page? Okay.
I think there was a question about if there's a link to the survey on this page, and it is in this updates section. So we can also put it in the chat just so folks have it.
Great.
And maybe we can just do that question on parking. So I don't have that at the top of my mind. So question was, I think, do the parking requirements in 1304 apply to counties? And if it's showing it on the map as like the circle extending into counties, that mean that those areas of the unincorporated are applicable to those county jurisdictions?
Yes, the law does apply to unincorporated areas as well. And I see the note about complexity. I think we're seeing these maps now that were directed to be created in the legislation. It may not be perfect. I think, as I mentioned, we're going to be providing some guidance. I think there may be ways to simplify that. Or I think, a potential way is to include in your code, a link to this map when it gets finalized to say, properties within these areas, this is what applies. But yeah, we recognize that it is a little complex. So we're kind of doing the best we can there.
And then,
hey, Nathan, sorry, I hate to be the timekeeper, but we do need to, so we'll try and continue to answer questions in writing. So keep an eye on that Q&A, and let's go ahead and move to your piece, Nathan.
All right, so.
On.
So this strategic growth and neighborhood center section is a couple different pieces of both SB 174 and HB 1313 that we've grouped together. You want to go to the next slide. So in order to have better engagement around these pieces that are more about kind of incentives, collaboration, and planning statewide, we'll have the strategic growth report that is required by SB 174. Will kind of serve as this engagement, larger planning process where we'll talk about neighborhood centers and potential transit areas as well. And I put this map of Colorado on here to show, the blue and red on that map is really the areas we were just showing the maps about where there's more a requirement to do something with the zoning, but obviously most of the state is outside of MPOs, and so there's still a lot of benefit to doing broader planning and collaboration between state, regional, and local agencies, and so that's really what this track is about. Next slide. So the strategic growth report is due October 31st, 2025. The statute says there should be policy recommendations to encourage fiscally and environmentally sustainable growth. We need to analyze land use scenarios of future growth, do that with a broad engagement process that considers the context of different regions and communities in the state, and then empower and promote local initiatives, ideas. So we're excited about this whole piece of it to really, think about all the great things going around in the state and how do we work together to amplify things that can lead to a growth pattern that is going to be more fiscally and environmentally responsible. Next slide. So one of the core pieces of this is this neighborhood centers piece, and that is both in 1313 and 174. And what's a neighborhood center? It's basically a kind of a locally designated neighborhood, much like how the transit centers are locally designated, that either is or can become a walkable, transit-ready, mixed-use neighborhood. And that's going to look really different in all different parts of the state. And so there's a lot of incentives already in the bills from the TOC Infrastructure Grant Program, CHAFA Affordable Housing Tax Credits the neighborhood centers will be eligible for. And then starting in 2026, state agency grant programs will identify incentives for neighborhood centers. Next slide. And this just is a quick graphic showing how that process will work. Dole will set the criteria for different regions and different parts of the state for what is a neighborhood center by June 2025. Local governments will then identify those neighborhood centers, submit those to DOLA. DOLA will have a kind of a clearinghouse map for the use by other state agencies to incentivize. And of course, what does that look like? What does incentivize mean? That's all still to be determined, but we want to have this process over the next couple years to talk to everybody about how to make that work best. Next slide. So within the strategic growth process, the way we want to use neighborhood centers also is, like I was just saying, first identify the criteria that fits the context of different regions and communities. Then in step 2, following what the direction in the statute, analyze 2 strategic growth scenarios for impact on housing, environmental, and infrastructure factors. So like one scenario being, growth as usual, and then kind of a neighborhood center focused growth scenario so we can compare and contrast potentially what are the impacts and have that information and data and analysis available. And of course, as we're doing this, we're building it into the process as we get a consultant team on board to work on all of these things, have inputs on the scenario and policy recommendations from the broad group of stakeholders around the state. Next slide. So the other piece of this then is in 1313 is what's called potential transit areas. And this is really something where if you think about everything we just talked about with neighborhood centers and how do we plan more strategically around the state and work together, it's really just a planning tool. It's created by the legislation to say, hey, maybe we need to look at these areas that have a lot of planned greenfield development. Maybe there's a lot of anticipated large transportation infrastructure investments, and there's also potential for future transit service and neighborhood centers in these areas. So there's some really good examples already of communities that are doing this work on themselves. And so our hope is these potential transit areas can kind of be a way to highlight and lift up the good work that's going on per the direction of statute that said to, really promote local ideas and see what we can do to all pull in the same direction. But a lot of good work going on. US 34 corridor, some burgeoning collaboration on the East I-70 corridor. And so, next slide. What we're thinking about for this is, per the legislation, we do have to publish some sort of initial draft map by September 30th. And so maybe just a couple of these are in the initial map, but given that this is just a planning tool, there's no reason that we couldn't extend this out and identify other of these areas and figure out, well, what is helpful, how do different organizations work together? Are they working together now? And it's just, how do we help give the resources to make what they're doing happen? And so we can kind of work on this throughout the strategic growth process over the next year or two. So that's the goal for this. It's really just kind of how do we draw, dashed bubbles around certain areas, but also want to clarify that this potential transit area piece is more kind of in this collaboration space and less in the optional transit area / other transit area space, because obviously the terms are very similar, but it has a very different purpose. So I think we have the timeline slide. So this is just the timeline slide showing how these things will work together in the process going forward. All right, I think, is that the last one for me? Oh yes, there was that last piece, sorry. A couple of pieces we didn't mention today just for time, but we wanted to put on the slide so you have it. That'll be later into 2025, but comprehensive plan guidance and the natural land and agricultural report that kind of also fits into all of these pieces. All right.
Okay. Thanks, Nathan. Thanks for running the slides, Kelly. Okay, we've just got housing planning, ADUs and next steps left. And so I'm gonna try and be brief so that we can reserve some time for some live Q&A here at the end. So one quick slide on housing planning. Next slide. Just showing you the implementation timeline here. So first off, it's true that housing planning is coming a little bit later, kind of. There are pieces of it that are very, very fast and pieces of it that have some more time. But we've already been getting questions, for example, about communities who have already recently completed local housing needs assessment. Will it be compliant? Well, as you can see here, the housing needs assessment methodologies are due to be published by the end of this calendar year. So that's a tricky question to answer at the moment. We have a draft self-assessment tool that I'm hoping to get finalized, fingers crossed, for being able to distribute as in the follow-up email to this meeting. I will certainly make sure that it's widely available once that is finalized, as well as some preliminary strategies menu information. That too is not meant to be finalized for the June 30th, 2025 is the deadline there, and yet we're getting questions now. So we are taking some steps to make sure that helpful information is available, sometimes if only in a preliminary way, but so that communities can start taking the steps that they're ready for. Again, H&A, housing needs assessment methodologies, are launching very shortly. We're going to talk more about that next month, and we will be finalizing that by the end of this calendar year. Also, same timeline, displacement risk assessment guidance, as well as regional resources study and the affordable strategies and displacement mitigation strategies menu. Okay, that's it for housing planning for now. If you'll permit us to move on and dive more into that in subsequent meetings. Similarly, brief comments on accessory dwelling units. So next slide is the timeline, just like what you're used to now. So similarly, we created some compliance guidance for ADUs. It's still in draft form, but I wanted to flag this for you. Coming to a webpage near you shortly. So please keep an eye out for compliance guidance for the ADU law. We're also going to be working on an ADU toolkit, and that's really not a lot of time, but based on some of these other deadlines, I'll say more time. So we will be talking about that in subsequent meetings as well. The ADU compliance date and compliance report are due June 30th of 2025. And then after we're able to review those compliance reports, we will launch the EDU grant program, which is a fee reduction encouragement grant program. More to come on that later. But in the hopes of reserving time, let's go next slide and move into wrap up and next steps. So we have for you, next slide, the topics for next month. That'll be September 27th, same time, same great channel. We're going to talk about updates and the final parking and TOC maps. So that'll be an opportunity to show you what happened with all the input that we will be receiving. Thank you in advance. Potential transit areas update, the local and regional housing needs assessment, initial input on guidance, and displacement risk assessment methodology, again, initial input. So we'll be showing you the draft tools for other topics, like we showed you the draft tools for TOC and parking today. Some links and reminders, the Engaged DOLA site. Hopefully it's more familiar now. Again, that is a new tool for us. So thank you so much for your clarifying questions today. Please keep them coming. We really want to make sure that that is a helpful first informational stop for anyone who's interested. So it's high level of functionality is critical for us. Sign up for office hours on that site, reach out for technical assistance. I can't tell you how much more clarity we've all been able to reach in those one-on-one technical assistance meetings. They're just fabulously informative. So please reach out at the first indication of a question. Please do review the Transit Org Community's draft maps and parking draft map by the 6th. Very soon. Thank you. Sorry about these quick turnarounds, and thank you. And then also please do take that parking management best practices survey. With those reminders, we'll just throw up here our contact information. If you have questions, please reach out. If you have feedback, let us know. We're very interested in how to make this whole process more interactive and helpful. So thank you so much for your time and attention and your questions today. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and we have about 20 minutes here for some live Q&A.